24 states are now locked in a legal war with the White House, and the fight is over something as basic as how you're allowed to vote. In the last few days, the Supreme Court has stepped in, a federal judge has pushed back, and the Postal Service has been dragged into the middle of it. If this ruling goes the wrong way, it could change how millions of Americans vote in this November's midterms. Let's break down exactly what's happening, because this story is moving fast and most people have no idea how big it's actually getting. Welcome back to the channel. Every week we break down the biggest stories shaping politics and power in America, cutting through the noise so you actually understand what's happening and why it matters. If that sounds like your kind of channel, hit subscribe, because today's story is one of the most important legal battles of the year. So let's start from the beginning. Back in late March, President Trump signed a sweeping executive order aimed at reshaping how elections are run across the country. The order pushed for new requirements around voter eligibility, including a demand that people show proof of citizenship documents when registering to vote in federal elections. It also targeted mail-in ballots, aiming to stop states from counting ballots that were postmarked by Election Day but arrived afterward, something many states currently allow. The administration framed this as an effort to protect election integrity and make sure the system is secure. But almost immediately, opposition started forming. Within days, Democratic attorneys general began filing lawsuits, arguing that the president was overstepping his authority. Their core argument was simple: elections in the United States are run by the states, not by the White House, and the Constitution gives that power to state legislatures and Congress, not the president acting alone through an executive order. The first wave of lawsuits came fast. 19 states joined together, led by attorneys general from places like New York, California, Michigan, and Massachusetts, and filed suit in federal court. They called the order an unconstitutional attempt to seize control of elections, warning it could create new barriers that make it harder for eligible voters to cast a ballot. New York's Attorney General didn't hold back, describing it as an authoritarian power grab and accusing the administration of prioritizing control over the will of the public. Whether or not you agree with that framing, it shows just how serious this fight became right from the start. As the weeks went on, more states joined in. Eventually, a coalition of 24 states and the District of Columbia banded together in a case led by Massachusetts, taking direct aim at the mail voting provisions of the order. Their argument was that the order would force states to completely overhaul how they run elections, and do it on an impossibly short timeline, in some cases mere weeks before primary elections and just months before general election mail voting was set to begin. They said this wasn't just inconvenient, it was disenfranchising, because rushed changes to election systems create confusion, errors, and voters getting turned away or having their ballots rejected. This is where the case landed in front of U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani. In June, she sided with the states on key points, ruling that important parts of the executive order were unconstitutional. She issued an injunction blocking the federal government from enforcing those provisions specifically against the 24 states and Washington, D.C. that had brought the lawsuit. That list included a mix of heavily Democratic states and key swing states, places like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, and North Carolina, states that could easily decide control of Congress in this year's midterms. The Trump administration didn't accept that ruling quietly. They appealed, arguing that the judge had moved too fast, that the case wasn't even ready to be decided yet because the Postal Service and other federal agencies hadn't finalized how they'd actually carry out the order. In legal terms, they argued the challenge wasn't ripe. Then in a separate case, brought by nonprofit groups including the League of Women Voters, Judge Talwani issued another injunction in August. This one went even further. Instead of just applying to the 24 states that sued directly, this order made clear that the block applied nationwide, to every state, not just the ones that filed suit. Once again, the administration pushed back, arguing the same thing, that it was too early for courts to weigh in. With two separate injunctions in place, the Trump administration took the fight to the Supreme Court, asking the justices to lift the block so the order could move forward before the midterms. The Solicitor General warned that dragging this through prolonged litigation would essentially run out the clock, meaning even if the administration eventually won the legal argument, it would be too late to actually implement the changes in time for this year's elections. And this is where things got dramatic. The Supreme Court sided with the administration on the state's lawsuit, lifting the injunction that had blocked the order for those 24 states and D.C. The majority didn't rule that Trump's order was actually legal, they ruled that the states had sued too early, before the rules were finalized, so the case wasn't ready for the courts to decide yet. That's a narrower, more technical ruling than it might sound like, but the practical effect was still huge. It cleared the path for the administration to move forward. Not everyone on the court agreed. The liberal justices dissented, and Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justice Elena Kagan, made a pointed statement, saying that this decision did not address whether the president's attempts to interfere with how states run the November 2026 elections were actually lawful. In other words, the fight over whether this order is constitutional is far from settled. The Supreme Court just removed one procedural roadblock, not the underlying legal question. Almost immediately after that ruling, the Postal Service issued its final rules for how the order would actually be implemented, which had been the missing piece the administration said courts were jumping the gun on. But interestingly, the Postal Service said it would not put these new rules into effect for this November's elections, seemingly trying to avoid last-minute chaos so close to voting. But the states weren't done. Just 2 days after the Supreme Court ruling, and only about 24 Democrat-led states filed an entirely new lawsuit, this time directly against the U.S. Postal Service itself, challenging the newly finalized rules limiting mail voting. Election officials involved in the case warned that with mail ballots for the midterms about to start going out within days, there simply wasn't enough time to implement these changes without causing real problems for voters and election offices already deep into their preparations. So where does that leave things right now? The legal battle isn't over, it's evolved. One injunction has been lifted by the Supreme Court on procedural grounds, but the broader question about whether the executive order violates the Constitution and oversteps presidential power hasn't actually been decided. And now there's a brand new lawsuit specifically targeting the Postal Service rules, adding yet another front to this fight, right as the clock ticks down toward the midterm elections in November. What makes this such a big deal isn't just the legal technicalities, it's what's actually at stake. We're talking about rules that could affect how tens of millions of people vote by mail, whether ballots that arrive a day or two late still count, and what kind of documentation people need to even register in the first place. In a midterm election where control of Congress could come down to a handful of close races in swing states, changes like these aren't just bureaucratic details, they could genuinely shift outcomes. This is also a pretty rare moment where you're seeing the separation of powers get tested in real time, the executive branch trying to reshape election administration, the states pushing back citing their constitutional authority, and the courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, getting pulled into the middle of it, with the clock running out before an actual election. It's worth pointing out that this isn't the first time mail voting rules have become a political flashpoint in America. Ever since the 2020 election, mail-in ballots have been at the center of ongoing arguments about election security versus voter access. Supporters of stricter rules argue that tightening deadlines and adding identity verification steps protects the integrity of the vote and reduces the chance of fraud or errors. Opponents argue that mail voting has an extremely low rate of documented fraud, and that sudden rule changes right before an election disproportionately affect people who rely on mail ballots the most, including elderly voters, people with disabilities, military members stationed overseas, and rural voters who live far from polling stations. What makes this particular fight different is the sheer speed and scale of it. Normally, changes to federal election administration go through a much longer process, agency reviews, public comment periods, and coordination with state election officials who need time to update their systems, train poll workers, and inform voters. Critics of the executive order argue that trying to force major changes into effect just months, or in some cases weeks, before ballots go out skips over all of that groundwork, and that's exactly why so many state officials are alarmed, not necessarily because of the policy goals themselves, but because of how abruptly they're being pushed through. On the other side, supporters of the order argue that federal oversight is necessary precisely because election rules vary so wildly from state to state, creating what they describe as inconsistency and confusion nationwide. They argue a president has the authority to direct federal agencies, like the Postal Service and the Election Assistance Commission, in how they operate, and that setting clearer standards benefits everyone, regardless of which state someone lives in. Both sides clearly believe they're defending the integrity of American democracy, they just completely disagree on what that actually requires. And that's ultimately why this keeps ending up in court instead of getting resolved through negotiation, because there isn't a middle ground both sides are willing to accept, at least not yet. So what happens next? Expect this Postal Service lawsuit to move fast, given how close we are to ballots actually going out. Expect more court rulings in the coming weeks, and don't be surprised if this ends up back in front of the Supreme Court again before November, especially if a lower court blocks the Postal Service rules the same way the earlier order was blocked. Keep an eye on how individual states respond too. Some may try to implement contingency plans of their own to protect voters regardless of how the federal case plays out. This is very much a developing story, and the outcome could still change more than once before Election Day. If you found this breakdown helpful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because I'll be tracking every twist in this case as it develops, and trust me, there will be more twists. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Should courts be stepping in this deep into election rules this close to voting, or should this have been settled long before now? I read every comment, and a lot of future videos come directly from what you all want covered. That's it for this one. See you in the next video. Stay informed, stay sharp, and I'll catch you next time.